Hello there, Cameron Giardini with Giardini Medicare, where we aim to make your transition to Medicare just a little bit easier. And as many of you may know, if you are transitioning from employer coverage or employer health insurance and you are starting Medicare or you're turning 65, there is coverage that can extend your employer coverage if you are retired or if you stop working, and that is called COBRA. So there are a lot of misunderstandings or misconceptions when it comes to COBRA coverage and Medicare. So this video, we are going to talk all about it, what you need to look for, and just some of the ins and outs for how COBRA can work for your family or for yourself when you become Medicare eligible. So let's take a look and dive right in. So the first thing we need to do is talk about what this video is going to entail. And the first thing, obviously, is we have to discuss what is COBRA. And we're also going to talk about various topics like, is COBRA creditable coverage for Medicare? How does COBRA work for those that are over age 65 or turning 65? So basically anyone with COBRA coverage along with Medicare eligibility. Also, things to keep in mind when you are Medicare eligible, how COBRA works for spouses or your family if they're under 65. And then lastly, we will finish everything off with a COBRA recap. So what is COBRA? You can see here that COBRA is an acronym that stands for the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, and it gives workers and their families basically an extension of their employer health insurance beyond their time of employment. So what happens is when you retire or if you stop working, you typically have access to your former health insurance, but at a greater cost because the employer is no longer subsidizing it. So yes, you will have the same exact coverage as far as drug coverage and medical coverage, but typically you will have to pay more for your COBRA coverage. It's not always the case, but we're just going with the averages. And when that happens, as you can see here, you typically have to pay up to 102% of the cost of the insurance. So COBRA is only really mandated generally for employers with 20 plus full-time equivalent employees. Ask your employer if they fall under that category. If it's smaller, they don't have to offer COBRA. If it's larger, they generally do. COBRA coverage is typically offered for 18 months after your employment ends, and it can be extended up to 36 months in certain circumstances. So it's not 36 months on top of the 18, it would just be 36 months total. So we talked a little bit about what exactly COBRA is. Now we have to talk about the two main reasons why when you are Medicare eligible, meaning you are turning 65 or you're already older than 65 and you're offered COBRA, you really do need to have Medicare Parts A and Part B to go with it. So the first reason that you want to have Medicare A and B to go with your COBRA is that you have to ask yourself the question, is COBRA creditable for Part B of Medicare? And the answer to that is no. Only active employer coverage is considered creditable for Medicare Part B. So just because your COBRA is technically an extension of your employer coverage, you are in no way, shape, or form actively employed, so it is not creditable for Medicare. And what that essentially means is if you do not get Medicare in a timely manner, you will be penalized for Medicare Part B if you choose not to get Medicare Part B and just have COBRA. The next question that you'll want to ask yourself is COBRA creditable for Part D of Medicare? And the answer to that one's a little bit different, but the answer is possibly. So every plan is a little bit different. You'll have to check with your company to make sure your COBRA coverage is considered creditable with Medicare's prescription drug plans. And essentially what that means is the coverage is expected to pay on average as much as the standard Medicare prescription drug coverage. So the way to think about it is that just means your COBRA drug coverage is as good or better than what you could get on Medicare. So the next reason it is super important to get Medicare A and B when you are 65 or older and on COBRA is the fact that once you become entitled to Medicare, Medicare is now primary to your COBRA coverage. What this means is if you're 65 or older and you go on COBRA, Medicare is automatically primary. If you don't have Medicare, you essentially do not have primary insurance. So it's not saying that if you're on Medicare and COBRA, Medicare is primary. It is saying that if you turn 65, Medicare is automatically assumed to be primary to your COBRA coverage. Now, there are very, very few circumstances where this may be not the case, or you may have an exception in your plan. Make sure if you have a plan like that, absolutely get it in writing, because 99% of the time we see people where their COBRA is automatically secondary to Medicare upon being Medicare eligible. I really want to take a moment to illustrate exactly what I mean when I say that Medicare becomes primary when you are entitled to Medicare at age 65 or older. So in this situation, let's say you go to the doctor's, and what happens is the doctor bills your insurance, which you're now 65 plus in age. That means they are going to try and bill Medicare first. So Medicare, again, is the primary insurer in this case. And then what happens after that is that if you have COBRA coverage, Medicare is going to try to coordinate with your COBRA and bill COBRA as secondary. So then this is what happens if you assume that your COBRA coverage is all you need upon being 65 years or older, and you do not have Medicare A plus B as primary. You no longer have this, so what happens is your doctor tries to bill Medicare, they don't get through to anything, and then what they can do is COBRA can step up and pay their 20% portion, because again, remember, Medicare covers 80% of bills for doctor's visits. So COBRA can either pay just the 20%, or what can happen is your secondary insurance, which in this case is COBRA, can say, we will pay absolutely nothing and pay 0%, because they are technically not obligated to pay for any procedures if your primary insurance has not paid yet. So secondary insurance is only designed to pay after primary insurance. If you do not have primary insurance, which is automatically Medicare when you turn 65 and you're not working, then again, you can either have no coverage or you can have very little coverage. So that is the reason why we always say when you're 65 or older, if you're eligible or if you're on COBRA, you have to get Medicare A and B. Don't just take our word when it comes to having Medicare A and B with COBRA. You can see here on a document from the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the governing body for Medicare, that you should enroll in Part A and B as soon as you stop working or lose current employer coverage, even if you plan to sign up for COBRA. Now, there is an 8-month window that you can enroll into Medicare after you complete your employment. However, that is only to avoid the Part B penalty. Right when you stop working, Medicare still becomes primary, so you'll want to get COBRA right when you stop working. You can check out other sources, but everywhere you look, you should see the fact that COBRA is secondary to Medicare, and you do want to have A and B of Medicare if you plan on starting COBRA coverage. There are a couple other things to consider when you're age 65 or greater and you are looking at COBRA coverage. Now, the first thing you'll want to consider is what will you be paying for your COBRA coverage? Again, some employers will choose to subsidize the full amount for a period of time. Others will cut it off immediately and you have to pay the full 102% of the premium when you begin COBRA. So you'll want to compare your COBRA premiums to what you could get with a Medigap plan or a Medicare Advantage plan. Because again, COBRA is essentially acting as a Medigap plan, being secondary to Medicare. So you really want to compare those details and the cost. Also, you want to take into consideration whether or not your COBRA coverage is creditable for Medicare prescription drug coverage. COBRA is typically more expensive than you would find with Medigap or Medicare Advantage, but if you do have very expensive medications, or if you do, and it is credible, you may be better off sticking with COBRA and Medicare for a short period of time. Lastly, you may want to consider what are your family options if you become entitled to Medicare at age 65 and you have COBRA, and we will talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. What can happen is that if you're eligible for COBRA and Medicare at the same time, your spouse and your dependent children, if you have any, they may be able to continue their COBRA coverage without you remaining on the COBRA plan. And this is plan dependent, so please check with your COBRA administrator or your employer to verify that your spouse or children can remain on your COBRA coverage, even if you choose to go your own route with Medicare plans. So that's something to take into consideration. If you have to stay on for your family, obviously that may be a better decision than making them find their own health insurance. But if you can get off and do a Medicare supplement or Advantage plan, it may be better to do that while they remain covered by your COBRA plan for the time being. Please keep in mind it's always important to check with other health insurance options for your family before deciding COBRA may be best for them. And the reason for that, as you can see here on healthcare.gov, is that if you pick a COBRA plan and then you realize it may not be the best option or you want to get other individual insurance options, you cannot just drop your COBRA coverage anytime during the year. So you can only drop your COBRA coverage if it is open enrollment or your COBRA coverage is running out and that 18-month window passed, or if your COBRA coverage costs are changing. So if your employer paid for the full COBRA and then after 5 months they no longer pay the full amount, that would qualify you to change. However, just wanting to change for the sake of changing your COBRA to a different plan is not possible outside of open enrollment. Okay, so let's wrap up everything that we talked about when it comes to COBRA and do a quick recap. So the first thing, COBRA is simply just a continuation of employer health insurance. It's the same exact coverage that you've been used to, just with a slightly different price and a slightly different structure as to how it works with Medicare. You can continue COBRA coverage past age 65, but you will want to get Medicare Parts A and B to be your primary coverage. It's also important, again, to compare your COBRA cost with potential Medicare Advantage or Medigap plans to see if that makes more sense financially compared to the COBRA option. And also, your family may want to continue COBRA coverage even if you do forego your coverage to get a plan like a Medicare Advantage plan or a Medigap plan. And as always, feel free to give us a call at Giardini Medicare if you have any questions about how Medicare coordinates with COBRA, or visit our website at gmedicareteam.com. Thank you.